I have with me Jonathan Davies from Happeo and Mike Klein from Changing the Terms. And we're going to be having a informal kind of discussion about internal communication and the product Happeo. So I just want to do a quick introduction on the guys. Mike's an internal communications expert with over 20 years experience working with companies like Shell, EasyJet, Barclays, Vodafone and many more. He's the principal of a company called Changing the Terms and past chair of the IABC in the EMENA region. You can find Mike's details at changingtheterms.com and we will link to those in the description. Jonathan is currently internal communications journalist at Happeo, and his background is in internal communications, content, branding. He's worked with companies like Spring-Est, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. VoiceWorks, TMF Group, as well as lecturing in Holland University of Applied Sciences. Jonathan runs Happeo's Internal Communications podcast, which I recommend that you take a look at, and we will also link to the description in that as well. Did I miss anything out in introductions, guys?
I think you're good.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
It for me.
So we're gonna jump into it, and we're gonna talk a little bit about internal communications, about digital transformation. But I think we'll start off with IC because I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to start just by hearing from you guys about how you kind of got into the area of internal communications. Maybe start with yourself, Jonathan. What made you move towards this? Was it something you decided to get into, or was it just sort of, an unnatural or natural progress?
Well, I think, and this is something that Mike will probably echo, it's kind of something that you roll into. You don't necessarily have the idea that, this is what I want to do. My girlfriend at the time was actually doing her thesis on internal communications at the Node.
Right.
And because I'm a native speaker, I had to edit it for her. So that ended up with me doing a large part of that thesis, and I got really interested in it. Then my job at TMF Group, they asked me to kind of develop some content, and we got a heavier focus on internal employer branding. And that's kind of how I rolled into it. I went from TMF Group, which is corporate financial services, to VoiceWorks, which is a tech company, and I've stayed in tech ever since. Also because I find that the stories of people that work in tech are generally a little bit more interesting, or maybe a little bit closer to my heart. So yeah.
Interesting. What about yourself, Mike? How did you end up in this area?
Well, like Jonathan, I stumbled into it as well. Before I became an internal communicator, I was a political campaign consultant, and I did political PR, public affairs in Washington and all over the U.S. And in '96, I decided to go to London Business School, mainly because I wanted to figure out how to commercialize my skills. And literally, I was in the campus placement resource center. I was reading this brochure about this firm that was in internal communication. I was reading this brochure and I was like, this is me they're talking about. And
Love when that happens.
Exactly. And about a year and a half later, I had a work permit and I was working for the firm and I was living in London, and
Cool.
I've been in internal comms pretty much nonstop ever since.
Wow. It's really interesting. It is great when you find that. I can remember that myself with the change management piece of the business that we do, and reading about that and having something similar and going, wait a second, that's what we do. That's the area I want to be in or move into. I think it's interesting that you mentioned culture when we were talking about the change between companies, and I think that definitely I feel will lend itself to an organization being more likely to be better at internal communication or not. I'd be interested to know what you guys feel about how big of a piece in culture plays in internal communication.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. I was interviewed for a research project on culture about a month and a half ago, and somebody asked me what my definition of culture was. And I described it as the combination of what an organization says it is, what it says its priorities, its principles, its values are, and what its actual values, priorities, and principles are, and how much pressure is put on people to maintain that gap.
All right, okay.
I know that's kind of a very negative definition of culture, but it's also a very actionable definition of culture, because once you realize that that's going on, then you can address the gap, and then you can create a much more authentic culture, and in so doing, a much more meaningful and positive and valuable environment for internal communications to take place in.
And I also think that culture is one of those areas where it's difficult to say how much of an impact it has on a business, but you know that you need a good, healthy, positive culture for that to be there. Harvard Business Review did a study on the impact of culture, specifically looked at motivation. And they found that one of those 6 factors that affects the motivation of employees is how much they feel aligned with the business. Now that's something that's tailor-made for internal communications, right? Their entire thing is creating alignment. Yeah. And that same study also found that companies with high total motivation see up to a 30% increase in revenue. Wow. That actually means that internal comms has a very big effect on business. It's not the type of things that you'll see back on a balance sheet.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not, they're not equating necessarily an increase in revenue to increased internal communications. There isn't that link, as you say, kind of between them.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe the challenge, measuring those non-financial sort of elements of a business. We were talking about, say, the value of content earlier on, and those sort of the soft skills within people. They often say that you can look at the degree someone has or the experience, but those kind of soft skills of communication, in other areas, I think they're becoming more important over time as we automate things, as technology takes over and does a lot more. The soft skills within individuals, as you're hiring someone, but also within companies. Do you know what I mean? That sort of other unmeasurable areas, if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the unmeasurable and soft skills, and for lack of a better term, soft measurements, because the paradox is that the soft stuff is extremely important, but because it's hard to measure, it's often hard to action.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've done, particularly in the research that Happeo's commissioned on the present and future of internal communication, is look at how could we turn some of these soft outcomes into hard measures. And I think we've made some real progress, particularly in terms of shifting ownership of the value of communication away from the communication function trying to defend it forensically, to actually having the communication function ask the business, how much is our support worth to you in tangible terms? If we don't communicate your change initiative, what's the risk going to be of failure? What's the financial impact going to be? And so by turning some of that stuff around, by flipping the script, as you say, that we're going to be able to turn these soft outcomes into very hard and very actionable, defensible and actionable measures.
It's interesting you brought up the research that you guys have been doing. So Happio's commissioned yourself to do these sort of research papers. Can you talk a little bit more about it? What kind of areas it covers? And
Sure. I interviewed 65 people around the world. About 50 of them are internal communications people. Actually, about 45 are internal communications people. The remainder are chief communication officers, heads of communication, and present and former C-suite decision makers. And the idea for the first 3 pieces of the series was to figure out, okay, where are we starting in internal communication? Where do we as internal communicators want to go? What's the biggest issue that we face and how can we fix it, which is measurement. And then we went to the heads of communication, the chief communicators. Then we went to the C-suite decision makers. And then I put together a panel of internal communication experts to say, okay, how could we actually meaningfully address what chief communicators in the C-suite want from us? Wow. And then the final report, which will have come out by the time this airs, is a summary that says, here are the 12 conclusions from the research that, if adopted and embraced by the internal communications world, can really change the trajectory of the profession.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think it's interesting that it's Happeo that is kind of driving this. How do you feel Happeo is kind of different in terms of the internal communication space and sort of taking a active role within the industry. You know, like this doesn't sound like something a lot of companies within the space are necessarily doing. You know, we were discussing before the video that there are, you know, apps and other tools out there, but a lot of companies, you know, from my experience, from what I've seen, they build their tool, they build their application, and they say it solves problem X or Y, and that's it. They don't necessarily get into, you know, talking to internal communicators, doing this sort of research and sort of finding out, okay, what are the 12 actionable things that we need to do, and how does our product address that?
Yeah, I think for us, I came from internal comms in a marketing background, and one of the things I learned as a marketer is way back when 1920s, there was a guy that said, I know half of my advertising budget is wasted, the problem is I don't know which half. Now, ironically, still today, 2019, that applies to internal comms for a very large part. And that doesn't necessarily apply to marketing anymore. Why? Because they've gone through a lot of technological driven revolutions.
And analytics explosion.
Analytics is a prime example of it, because simply put, what is out there is not wasted anymore because you can measure its effect. Even posters outside, if you have a unique link for it, you can track its effects. So internal comms hasn't gone through that revolution yet. But that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that they get that tool set that changes the way that they can operate, gives them the chance to take a break from only the do executive things, because they get overrun with requests, and rightfully so, because they have an important function. And we want to help them take that step back, see strategically, this has been the impact of our message, and this is a direction we need to go to help the company perform better. Because ultimately, that's what they do. If internal communications does really well, the company will do even better.
Because people are able to get the information that they need at the time that they need it, and they're up to date with the, you know, the company culture piece. I think that the sort of staying aligned to that definition you gave, I know you were saying it was sort of, you know, could be perceived as negative, but I think it is quite interesting, because there is often that gap, and it is what the organization perceives something to be, and then what it actually is, and how much effort they want sort of employees to put into to sort of,
and also what they're telling customers about who they are versus how they operate on the inside. But I think the key thing, coming back to your question about Happio's role in challenging the profession rather than just simply trying to build the best tool, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think, one, the state of the internal communication profession is such that really it needed somebody to come in and say, there is a better way to do it, and it's not just by having a better tool. It's about by creating a better environment in which internal communication can operate within the organization and within the overall communications world. Because bear in mind that there's this huge trend that's going on right now, where the lines between internal and external communication are blurred. They're increasingly blurred. And the challenge is that a lot of external communication people say, oh, there's not really a need for internal communication anymore. But the dynamic of internal communication is fundamentally different from the dynamic of external communication. You know, when you create a boundary, you create a space that everything's happening inside of. It increases the pressure, it increases the heat, it increases the emotions, it increases the speed at which things happen. And that requires a different set of skills. It's like the difference between, say, racquetball and tennis. It's a different set of skills, even though you're playing with a paddle and a ball.
I think I'm terrible at both.
Well, so am I. Let me use another analogy then. It's like with fried chicken. When you just throw fried chicken into a pot or into a fryer, you get a different result than if you throw it into a pressure cooker. Because Kentucky Fried Chicken is cooked in a pressure cooker. And it's a completely different product than what you're going to fry up in your own frying pan at home, even if all the ingredients are the same.
There's other things that impact, and I think that's an interesting point that you make, that it's not just the tool. So what do you guys feel are the other areas when it comes to internal communication, that you need to bring together. Like we often, when we talk about digital transformation with customers, we say it's the people, it's the process, and it's the technology. And our biggest challenge often is that customers are like, well, we've swapped out this piece of technology. They've got Google, they've got Dropbox now, they can share things. So, the box is ticked, we're done, we've digitally transformed. But like, if you don't bring the people along with you, you don't do the change management, you don't look at the processes, I think they say 7 times plus or something, someone has to do an action before they will make that their embedded choice and not go back to the way they used to do it. So what other areas do you guys feel have the biggest impacts, without giving away too much on your 12?
I'm happy to give away whatever there is to give away. I mean, this is not proprietary in the sense that we want to own this.
Yeah, sure.
We need to bring this understanding to the market, to the profession, so that they can really make the best use, not just of the tool, but of their own roles as internal communicators and of internal communication as a differentiator and difference maker in the business.
Coming back to the measurement piece that Jonathan was talking about.
Yeah, but that's also why Mike and Happeo align so well, because he wants the same thing that we do. We never saw it as we'll provide a tool to do this.
Yeah,
it's much more than that. Everything else needs to come around. That's why we needed that research, because it wasn't there, and Mike was uniquely positioned to do that. So the insights that he generated from that research, which is publicly available, also affected our product roadmap.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because again, we want to help that field. We don't just want to provide a tool.
But just coming back to the question of for you guys, what do you feel is the key areas outside of the tool that customers need to look at, say, when they're implementing Happeo? What's the other areas that they need to think about?
Yeah, adoption rate is a massive importantly thing. You can have a great tool, but if nobody uses it, it's not a great tool. That's why things like, and I really would advocate for people looking for any type of software tool, ask your vendor very critically about their adoption rate. That's hugely important. Ask also what their design process is like. We have, let's say 10% of our workforce are user experience designers. That's a lot, but that's also what sets us apart from others. So that natural kind of adoption is really important.
Not forced. Sort of.
Exactly. It needs to be an accessible tools for the people that use it on the admin side, but also the end users, because they are what determines the product success. That goes into a deeper strategical rollout. And that's, for example, something where you start determining, okay, when we launch the platform, is it going to be populated with content? If so, what type of content? Have we determined what our consistent tone of voice is? Because sometimes it's people just starting out. In case if we have smaller customers, we run across this. And I mean, I'm sure Mike has many more examples to add of running this, especially in large organizations. This type of change management trajectory.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of pieces, but it's not just about the embrace of the tool. The tool is a platform upon which and through which and by means of which organizations accelerate their own development. And so the key thing from my perspective is a level of ownership. If you've got 90% adoption and nobody owns the platform, sustaining that's going to be very difficult. And if that ownership has confidence not just in the tool, but in their own role as a communicator and ultimately as a leader in that organization, regardless of where they sit, regardless of what their title is, if you are agitating and sustaining and pushing and gyrating the platform, you need to have a sense of what your own sense of mission is in the grand scheme of things. Otherwise, it's going to simply be a tool for moving disembodied messages throughout the business.
Yeah. There's no reason behind it, sort of pushing it forward,
or that the reason for it, namely in some organizations, I've talked to some customers, and they've came in with fairly terrestrial ambitions in some cases to be better than a platform that didn't work, or to serve 2 or 3 tactical objectives, and you can serve those objectives and probably sustain a certain level of engagement. But if you realize that this could actually be the engine and the fusion reactor for your business, you're going to have a completely different context for what you're doing.
Well, I think that's an interesting point that you make, that it could have this huge transformational effect. How important then is for a project like this that a company's bringing in, having some sort of executive sponsorship, like how high in the organization do people tend to need to go, particularly in large organizations, to ensure success if it needs to, if it is this important and it needs to be this important?
Yeah, I think you've got a beautiful answer for that, because one entire report was dedicated to it in the research series.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've got to. It's best to have somebody own the platform and somebody own internal comms. And there's a huge debate in the industry about who's the best owner of internal comms, whether it's HR, whether it's corporate comms, whether it's marketing, whether it's the CEO, or something else. My stock answer is to have the executive sponsor be the individual who has the most stake in driving change and transformation in the business, because that's going to give internal comms the lift that it needs to really stand out and really deliver for the organization rather than just for its functional owner.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also going to differ if you're in Europe or if you're in, for example, North America. There's research out there that shows that in North America, C-level leadership and their visibility is more of a challenge and more of a valued subject to tackle, whereas in Europe it's more about line management. So that also depends, what is your company culture like?
Which comes back to the culture piece
exactly.
We have that challenge in Ireland within IT, that often there isn't an executive seat or a board seat for IT within Irish companies, and that was a very interesting change for me when we started off as an Irish only business, and we started selling to the UK. We eventually merged with a UK company. But for me, from a sales point of view, the transition of moving to the UK and suddenly IT and technology having a CIO or CTO sort of a role in Ireland, it's often with Irish homegrown businesses, it's often IT directors or IT managers. There isn't that. It's seen as a cost. It's seen as the same as electricity bill. There's something we have to pay. It's not seen as that something that can have some sort of change. Sorry, Mike.
Well, and also the whole issue of cost is probably the single biggest black elephant in the room that we as internal comms have to deal with. But the irony is that when I was talking with C-suite decision makers, they were much more relaxed about cost than corporate communicators or even IC people were. IC people particularly are very defensive about, and they've been made to feel defensive about the amount of cost that they generate, even though in the grand scheme of things,
it's not
a couple $100,000 on a platform is nothing in a multi-billion-dollar corporation. When I worked for a CFO, he basically said, forget about the cost, because he knew that in the grand scheme of things, it was nothing. And I guess that also ties into ownership as well, because when you're an HR department, IC's share of your cost may well be higher than as a CFO or a COO who's operating with much bigger
we've seen that within our own customers, that the IT budgets are often huge compared with maybe what a HR budget might be. And so an internal communications tool like Happeo would be a large percentage of maybe a HR budget, but of an IT budget that's maybe in the millions or more, in a larger company, then it's not. So I think that's a challenge as well. And I think, as you say, you're almost not entirely sure where internal communications sits. So even when you're approaching a company, who do you speak to? It can depend internally within the business, or the size of the business, or where the business is.
Absolutely. I mean, as an internal communication consultant, I know that
all too well.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, even me, when I did internal comms, I sat in the branding and communications department, and then later at a different company, I sat in the marketing department. And then another colleague of mine who then later came in sat in the HR department. And it can be a mix of any of those. It's quite eclectic.
I think it is a challenge certainly from a sales point of view. It's a challenge when you're approaching a company, trying to figure out who to talk to. But also if you're doing research, if you're any sort of area within internal comms, it's difficult. If you don't know who to contact, with IT, it's very, very distinct. It's been a role for a long time, and I think it'd be interesting to sort of project maybe 10 or 20 years into the future, will internal comms roles become more solidified, like IT? Like IT is a very solidified role, but maybe 20 years ago it wasn't, or 30 years ago. It was more difficult, the idea of a CIO or a CTO,
Well, my hope, and one of the drivers of the research, is that I fully expect the trend towards internal-external convergence to continue. My hope is that it's internal that's seen as the driver of communication going forward, however. And if you look at the whole dynamic, it makes sense, because employees are actually the most formidable external communication channel any organization has. Not just when it comes to customers, but also when it comes to recruiting and when it comes to dealing with government stakeholders. Employees have a lot more credibility than the disembodied corporate voice. The challenge is that the convergence will take place before the real awareness of the internal dynamic becomes widespread.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I've always found, and that's just personal, it's not research backed or anything, but I've always found internal comms to be a very good natural fit for HR. I could see, I've spoken to actually quite a few HR directors recently, and every single one of them said that one of their main concerns right now is building an HR analytics dashboard that is mature enough to just give them an overview of everything that they need to see what's going on. And I see communications actually fitting into that very well, because it can be measured, it can be tracked, and then you can feed that impact directly into things that internal comms affects, which is retention, onboarding cost reduction, absenteeism reduction, and later on also commercial increases.
Yeah, and engagement from employees and stuff as well.
Yeah. There's a caution I would have around that, though, a big caution, which is that a lot of those numerical tools tend to drive one-size-fits-all thinking about how to address organizations and their populations, particularly employee engagement measures. Employee engagement surveys are designed to treat everybody equally, both in terms of what's driving their engagement, their level of engagement, and the value of their engagement. But as human beings, we know we engage differently.
Yeah.
Some people just simply want to work from 9 to 5 and have some money left over to pay for the boat that they want to use on the weekend. Other people want to transform their professions. Other people want to become CEO. And you can't, measuring employee engagement with a one-size-fits-all tool just negates all that. And conversely, the level of importance of people in the organization isn't necessarily what shows itself up on the org chart.
Where do you guys sort of see things, in 5 or 10 years' time? A lot of companies talking about machine learning now and AI. How do you see those sort of influencing the internal communications piece? Maybe particularly with something like Happeo, and then Mike could jump in.
Yeah. So I always love talking about AI because it opens up a realm of kind of romantic dreams of where it could be going, and unfortunately a lot of it is that. I think I've been looking into it, and my very low-level explanation from a non-technical point of view is there's 3 levels of it. You've got artificial narrow intelligence, which is a computer just mimics a specific set of human behavior. Artificial general intelligence, which is where a computer can mimic all human behavior. And artificial super intelligence, which is where a computer is so freaking intelligent that it can solve world hunger with the snap of a finger.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're nowhere near the last 2 levels, and we're just now approaching artificial narrow intelligence. I think the easiest example is a self-driving car that you're now seeing a lot.
It's a very specific task that the computer can do.
Yes, exactly. So machine learning is generally like the way to approach that artificial narrow intelligence thing, and that consists of 2 essential components: a database from which to read on, and an algorithm that essentially reads
takes actions. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we're now doing with Happeo is we're releasing the hashtags feature, and I don't want to downplay its importance and make it sound like, it's Instagram, Twitter, that type of hashtagging thing, just the standard popular idea. It goes quite a bit deeper than that, because what hashtags will allow us to do is build up a database of language that associates content to language. And eventually, when we have that database, we want an algorithm to read and predict what type of content would suit the language used there best. And that's when we're talking about, getting into what we spoke of previously, kind of removing the automating the mundane things away, or the repetitive tasks.
And
with AI, you can just go further than only repetitive tasks.
Okay.
And really assist.
Yeah. And for you, Mike, you had an interesting idea on this, of the sort of convergence of the technologies over time.
Exactly. I mean, ultimately, if you look at the platforms that were around 10 years ago, they kind of sort of behave very similarly today, much more so than they did 10 years ago. I think today's platforms will, in varying speeds and varying ways, integrate things like AI, different types of AI, different flavors of it, and also other functionalities that customers are demanding. But that the real power is going to be in the human intelligence, not just on the client side, but really on the provider side, and the extent to which providers are going to be able to support and work with and catalyze the use of their tools through their clients, so that the clients get the maximum advantage and value out of the tools and out of the service.
So it's that secondary piece. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, because like we were saying, we've sort of seen that within the G Suite Microsoft piece, where the tools now essentially have 90% the same sort of features. So it's more, the differentiation is more the approach, the culture. As you say, how the companies differentiate themselves in terms of the strategy and the consultancy sort of part of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the vision.
Yeah.
So what is it that we're developing towards?
Yeah. It's not just now, like what the tool does right now, but what.
Exactly. Are we just plugging holes in a leaky boat, or are we making it so that that boat will never leak again?
One thing I would add is really about practitioner confidence. Right now, practitioners have access, even though, yes, internal communications is an issue, is an area that's facing constant challenges to its credibility, to its ability to do work, to its ability to deliver, to its ability to get resources. It's never been a better time to be an internal communicator, and the tools that I see people have never been better than they are now.